Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today we're going to be talking all about the best projects in the Bitcoin DeFi space as that's starting to grow. We welcome back Michael, who's head of written research for us on our new platform. How's things going, Michael?
Good, good. Busy, but very well. How are you?
Pretty good. Got the newborn at home and back and forth between Bali and Australia and that kind of thing, as well as doing all this research. So you're doing a great job.
Yeah, that's been a bit hectic. I had the second child, but we're surviving. I'm getting some sleep.
Great to hear. Now, we've both been covering some of the emerging projects in this space. We're going to talk about some of the older ones and some newer ones that you guys maybe haven't heard of. But this is something we did a write up on about how the Taproot upgrade is going to allow for some of these newer technologies to come to Bitcoin or Bitcoin layer twos and Bitcoin sidechains. We covered this over a year ago, and we certainly saw a bit of hype more recently around May when we did a write up on the Bitcoin ordinals and stamps, and that got a lot of hype at the time and actually congested the Bitcoin blockchain. But I guess today we're focusing more on the other newer projects that are coming out of the DeFi space. So I guess to start off with, something to probably mention is a lot of the criticism from the pure Bitcoin maximists that believe Bitcoin should only be hard money, and they're definitely not for these other things like the stamps and NFTs and DeFi on Bitcoin. And then you've got the other crowd that want to see it move forward as well. So that's something just to keep note of as well if it happens to get to a hard fork or other upgrades in the future. And probably the other thing is just some of the Bitcoiners like to criticize Ethereum layer twos for those points of centralization, which they certainly are, a lot of them. There's different trade-offs, and even other layer twos in terms of their centralization. So I guess what are your general thoughts on those things before we get into the projects?
Yeah, there's a little bit of an ethical background to the story. And so, for those that have been around in blockchain for a little while, you'll know that the whole movement started around this idea of decentralization and independent sovereign money. And so, Bitcoin is still the most decentralized network. It is the hardest at money. It is, sound money. And now, the reason why this gets a little bit interesting is because obviously, like in blockchain, you can make a lot of money by trading the right assets and using DeFi and farming and staking and all this on all different platforms. But ultimately, the whole point about why this existed and people weren't just going to the stock market, it was because Bitcoin was this decentralized asset and decentralized money. Now, the reason why this becomes an interesting conversation is because most of the options of being able to use Bitcoin as collateral are not on Bitcoin. So you either go to a centralized service like all the ones that just sunk last year, like Voyager and Celsius, or a centralized exchange where you're using your Bitcoin as collateral to be able to do things in DeFi or to take loans against your Bitcoin through a centralized service, or going to maybe a less secure, semi-centralized chain to be able to use services. So this is why this is a really interesting topic, and I think while the Bitcoin community is torn a little bit about it, it's an essential piece of the infrastructure. And if Bitcoin is going to become the settlement layer and the base layer of money, like I believe it will be, then this is something that has to happen. Because how else are you going to, use your Bitcoin as collateral to get a mortgage or, whatever it might be? You buy a car, you buy a Bitcoin, and then you borrow against your Bitcoin to buy a car. Like,
Yeah.
this is the world that we could potentially live in. But there's no point in having decentralized money if all of the lending services are centralized.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just so relevant now. We saw the news in the last 24 hours about CZ and Binance, and it's just all heading to this point where, once again, the US and BlackRock, the big boys, want control over that money coming in, and they want to generate money off fees. I guess that's okay for those people that want to invest that way, but there's certainly, as you said, that cypherpunk mentality that Bitcoin emerged from, where people want to have their own custody, their own sovereignty, but then be able to take out their loans or do their trading and swap coins and that all from their own ledger or whatever wallet they're running. So yeah, really important stuff there. I guess before we get into a general overview of Bitcoin on DeFi, most of these projects are using one of four technologies. So everyone's probably heard of the Lightning Network by now with its channels, and again, it's kind of centralized. Think of them as hubs where there has to be a certain amount of money before less money than what's in there can route through it to the next channel, and so on. We've then got the Liquid Network, which is more of like a federated sidechain between a lot of the different exchanges and players. So like very, very centralized, but obviously quick to move coins. Stacks is a really interesting one. that's its own smart contract layer. That's starting to be, I guess, the one where there's the most ecosystem emerging around, as well as Rootstock. That's an Ethereum compatible, again, sidechain that uses pegs and whatnot, so not actually on Bitcoin. So I guess they're the four that a lot of these projects are going to be using one of these technologies as we get into them. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously got my biases and my preferences around all of them. I'm a big believer in, being as decentralized as possible. And this is why Bitcoin, again, like Bitcoin, the competitor argument has gone now. Like it used to be, there was going to be a new, better version of Bitcoin. There was going to be a better, harder money, but that argument has finished now. And I'm a huge Ethereum fan as well. I first got into Ethereum, but the conversation, while I disagree with the narrative, there's still a conversation around, well, this technology will surpass Ethereum. This layer 2 smart contract will surpass Ethereum. I don't think any of them will, but there's still a conversation around it. But there's no conversation anymore about Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin is the ultimate hard money.
Yeah, and that's important for people you're talking about in terms of money, not necessarily in terms of DeFi. We can see all these other, say, Ethereum ecosystem just grow into the trillions, and if all that liquidity is there and the volumes and whatever, then it's going to become harder just because of Bitcoin's technical limitations to recapture that, I think, to some degree. But no, I think there's no doubt it's one that the hard money argument, yeah.
That's why, I think this conversation is great, and we can talk about some of these projects, because if we can then integrate Bitcoin in a decentralized way into all of the great infrastructure and pioneering that Ethereum has done, then this is the world that we were looking for.
Absolutely. So, are there any projects you want to start off or mention first in particular?
Well, I think just to touch on the Lightning Network there. So I think the big one, obviously, the integration that happened with El Salvador, and they had, is it the Chivo wallet? It was kind of like a wallet that was brought out by the government and built with the guys over at Strike. And essentially was made it so that they could open this channel and people could then be paying with Bitcoin in real time, and it could actually be used in a transactional way. So we've seen probably real big countrywide adoption of that technology. And so I think over the next coming period of time, I would love to start seeing more type of adoption like that.
Yeah, so for people at home, El Salvador, the first country that's adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. If you're new to the space, that might come as a shock hearing that sentence. But we recently saw, was it Argentina, the election go down there with someone that's very anti-central bank. So Argentina may be the next country who suffered bad inflation for ages that turns to Bitcoin. I think that's something, once we get into a bull market, we're going to see a few countries go, hey, maybe we should do this too. But yeah, you can argue that it's using the Lightning Network and wallets in these countries. Yeah, it's centralized and in terms of the hubs and whatever, but that's obviously a big step forward even still from the banking system, and anyone can download that wallet that has a smart device and start sending each other small amounts of money through the Lightning Network. I think it's a huge step forward.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've got a few different things which we can chat about here. Do you want to kick off with?
I think, well, I guess just quickly, people are probably familiar. Let's go through some of the more familiar ones. Thorchain is still one of the best options for people that have their crypto on their hardware wallet and want to know how to swap some Bitcoin for Ethereum or all these other main chains that they're across now. Binance Chain, Avalanche, Cosmos, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, Doge there. So this is probably still the best project, I think, in terms of has good liquidity. You can do it from your own wallet. Don't have to go to the centralized exchange, for example. So that's one that I own in my portfolio that we've done write-ups on before that people might have been familiar with. And the other thing to mention is wrapped Bitcoin. So wrapped Bitcoin is the version that's on another chain that's pegged or tied through different mechanisms with Bitcoin, and then gets it in the ERC20 token version, for example, if it's going on Ethereum. Now that's now widely available on Optimism, Arbitrum, Polygon, the Ethereum layer 2s, but also on some other layer 1s and that type of thing. And now we see, I guess, newer derivatives of that as well. So Rootstock might have RBTC, and I think there's a few others that you were going to mention. So just for people to get their heads around that kind of pegging and tying mechanism.
Yeah, so this works differently from how Thorchain does. And for anyone who hasn't played around with Thorchain before, go download the Thor wallet, go to Thor Swap, have a play around with it, even if you just do a test run. Because if we existed in a world where you were holding one particular crypto asset and then all exchanges were to shut down and you're now have an inability to be able to trade out of that asset off of that blockchain, Thorchain is the core infrastructure solution that we need because it allows you to go between blockchains without an exchange and without a bridge. Essentially, you can swap. Um, the wrapping of Bitcoin has become like a controversial topic because you can see it now. I think it's even in the top 15 now of projects. They list wrapped Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and that's Bitcoin that's been taken off of or taken out of circulation and then reprinted as WBTC in a centralized way. And so there's a couple of really interesting projects that are trying to do that in a in a decentralized way, in a non-centralized way.
Yeah.
So one of the more interesting projects which I think has popped up is I'm a little bit of a fan of the Polkadot ecosystem because it has a little bit of a different thesis to maybe what Ethereum has done, where you have these app chains or these individual siloed chains where they are all interoperable because they all use the underlying tech stack and they all have a native bridge built into their source code called XCM. And so there's a project called Interlay, which is a Polkadot parachain, but their whole point is to wrap Bitcoin in a decentralized way. And so they've got these things called vaults, and it works in a really similar way, I guess, to the channels do in the Lightning Network, where anyone can set up a vault, and the amount of money that passes through the vault has to be secured by the same amount of money in that vault. But you can choose the vault that you want to pass through, and you can natively wrap and unwrap Bitcoin from the Bitcoin blockchain to the Interlay chain, and then it gets reproduced as IBTC, and then it's natively right across the whole Polkadot ecosystem. There's a million bridges from Polkadot to Ethereum. You can do anything with it. There's DeFi applications on the Interlay website themselves. They've got a DeFi hub, and this project I think is like under $3 million market cap as well. So it's a really interesting project. I think they've only just come out recently with the feature. I think they've wrapped about 70 Bitcoin already. So that's one that I'm watching. The other interesting one is a bit of a pivot from another project from last cycle, which was ICP, the Internet Computer Protocol.
Yeah.
And this was a hugely controversial project when it first launched because they kind of got pump and dumped a little bit by FTX. And they shot up to $700 a coin and then threw all the way back down to pretty much one. And they're a very interesting blockchain. There was some criticism around them being kind of centralized, but they've rectified a lot of that now. They've open sourced their base code. But they do this thing called a reverse gas model where the developer actually pays the gas and they load up a canister. Yeah. And so when you use the internet computer, you don't actually have to pay the gas transactions because the person hosting the app does. And their claim to fame is that they're 100% on chain. So even the front end of a website is all housed on chain. It's not like Amazon Web Services on the front end and then settlement happens on Ethereum. The whole thing is on chain.
Okay.
Now, what they have recently done, they've pivoted a little bit, and they're not so focusing as much on their settlement layer, and they've sort of now in the ballpark where they want to compete with the Filecoins and the Arweaves for data storage.
Yeah.
So you can store front-end data on the internet computer, and they have built a technology called chain key technology where you can have a wallet on the internet computer that will directly generate a wallet on the Bitcoin network, and they can talk to each other perfectly. And so you, again, can lock Bitcoin on the Bitcoin network, and it gets reprinted on the internet computer as CKBTC, chain key BTC. They also then have bridges everywhere. You can bridge to Ethereum, all sorts of stuff. And so that's another really interesting technology where like another project, another protocol has seen the value of Bitcoin as a hard asset and has tried to decentralize the wrapping of it to allow DeFi functionality. So another one just to keep an eye on, pay attention to, because I think that's an interesting play that they've got going on there.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess you said a couple of interesting things there. Firstly, just for people at home, when we talk about stacks, the ticker is STX. There's another project called Stacks OS, as in operating system, which is in the space that Michael just mentioned, on-chain data storage like Filecoin and Arweave and that type of thing. So not to be confused. But when you said about the amount of wrapped Bitcoin that's now listed on CoinMarketCap and that type of thing, so if we continue to see Ethereum grow, do you know what I mean? If, let's say that the majority of Bitcoin was now wrapped and pegged to Ethereum, that could really upset a lot of the miners or the Bitcoin maxis. And in theory, they can then do some sort of, I guess, hard fork and change the rules and get the Bitcoin away from that, or scare people into even thinking that that could happen. So that's a very interesting thought experiment there. If that continues to grow and the majority of Bitcoin is then on Ethereum and or other chains in the DeFi world rather than Bitcoin's layers being able to capture it itself.
And then the remaining circulating supply is all locked up by BlackRock in an ETF. Like that, and that's an interesting world to think about.
Yeah, let's hope we don't end up there. A couple more smaller ones that we're currently doing research on, or that we just want to put on people's radar, I guess, doing some interesting things. Money on chain, mint layer, minting different tokens and assets, Botanex, layer 2 EVM on Bitcoin, and Sovereign is one that we actually did share some research on the other day. So great to see things like token issuance, borrowing, being able to earn on your Bitcoin, all that type of thing in a more decentralized manner. But anything else from you, I guess, to wrap up, Michael?
Just as well, paying attention to like the BRC20 space. So people are trying to create now like a token standard on Bitcoin as well. And so that's going to have ramifications as well. And it works a little bit differently because I think they have to be pegged to a Satoshi, or you imprint a token onto a SAT, similar to how the ordinals work.
Yes.
And so I think that's going to be an interesting watch as well. If there was a bunch of like token standards and different projects that decide to issue their token on Bitcoin, there will be a whole bunch of utility and DeFi applications that come along there too. So we've earmarked a few of these. We'll do write-ups on them coming up over the coming weeks, and I think watch this space because it's still a sector which is important. It's important that it grows.
Yeah, so ordinals, I guess, were those first ones with the NFTs and whatever using the witness data. But I think stamps was an upgrade, I guess you can think of it as, using those UTXOs, as you said. So I think it's a bit like NFTs on the Ethereum space. Anything that was like a very original, old, or first, or got a good community behind it, we could see very much a resurgence of those NFTs on Bitcoin. They got a bit of hype back in May. But no, that's great stuff, mate. Keep up the great work with all the written research. If you guys aren't aware already, head over to the website. We're still running that lifetime special. We can join our premium research center and the Facebook group, all for that one low price of $700. So great stuff, Michael. We'll chat again soon.
Sounds good. See everybody.
Thanks, guys.